Hi listeners, Dave here. We'll be back with a whole new season of How God Works starting in early March. But in the meantime, we wanted to share a few shows from our archives that speak to some of the most pressing challenges we're all facing today. Right now, conversations about anything beyond the weather can feel like dangerous territory. Actually, now that I think of it, even that can be a loaded topic these days. Levels of distrust, division, and outright hate are spiking in the US and in many parts of the world. So when everyone around you is thinking in terms of us versus them, how do you break out of the mold? How do you stand for what you believe in while still building bridges rather than tearing them down? On this episode, we'll take a look at exactly that.
We were playing baseball in the parking lot. It was near my neighborhood. It was easy access. We could all walk with our little equipment.
At 11 years of age, Larry Ward was doing what you might expect 11-year-old boys to do. He was playing baseball with his friends. They weren't blocking streets or creating a ruckus. They were playing in a big open parking lot.
And even though we've been playing there for months, someone decided we shouldn't play baseball there. And all of a sudden, a police car pulls up and people get out with their guns in hand.
And fired a few warning shots at 11-year-old boys. Unarmed 11-year-old boys, unless you count a Babe Ruth slugger 100 feet away as a deadly weapon. Why did they do this? As Larry will tell you, there wasn't anything special about him that might make him seem dangerous, except that he was black. And unfortunately, this frightening event wasn't an isolated experience for him. As an adult, he faced more race-related violence.
I remember being chased by the KKK in Florida. We had our house firebombed in Idaho when we lived there.
When Larry tells that last story about a white supremacist group bombing his home, he says people often ask him when in the 1960s it happened. But it wasn't the 1960s. It was 1996. In the US and other parts of the world, hate and prejudice based on ethnicity, religion, gender, and sexual orientation are not a thing of the past. They still occur all too often. We humans regularly divide the world into us and them. And when it comes to them, those other types of people, we're often willing to discount their needs, treat them unfairly, disparage them, or even intentionally harm them. But are we doomed to be this way? Or can we change the dynamic from a competitive to a cooperative effort? Can we learn to love our neighbor, and maybe even our enemy? On today's episode, we'll talk to NYU professor Jay Van Bavel to understand the deeper mechanisms at work when it comes to group conflict, and how to rework our evolutionary tendencies to create healthier societies.
We have this notion that we are tribalistic creatures, and that's almost like an inevitable outcome of our evolutionarily ancient brains. That doesn't have to be the case. We are capable of forming moral circles that are more and more inclusive and expansive.
And with Zen Buddhism teacher and author of America's Racial Karma, Larry Ward, about how the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh helped him to begin healing the wounds inflicted by racism, and how these same tools can help all of us to foster a more equitable and caring world.
In the Zen tradition, if you go deep enough into the stillness that tradition offers you, you begin to heal your nervous system.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. One thing we hear again and again is that humans are tribal by nature. We want to divide the world into groups, ours versus all the others. Jay Van Bavel, a professor of psychology and neuroscience at NYU and co-author of the book The Power of Us, has been studying this tendency for decades.
I think the way that this evolved in us as humans was that we lived together in small communities for mostly the entirety of human history. And so our brains are wired in ways that allowed us to survive. We are the ancestors of people who are really good at fitting in and working in groups and cooperating. And so we look to people like us and we trust them and we can cooperate with them. And as well, we look to identify people who are not part of us, who are them, because those people through evolutionary history potentially represented a risk. And so we are wary of outgroup members and a bit more cautious around them and don't trust it as much. And conflict can get stirred up easily when you have an in-group and an out-group in a situation.
That makes sense. Evolution isn't about being nice. It's about survival and reproduction.
Our brain evolved to survive, and it is more efficient to chunk the world into categories and use what we know about those categories. This is something that the mind does very rapidly. We chunk all kinds of things into categories. I know this is a table beside me, and this is a chair underneath me, and it's a book behind me, and that is a cup of tea in front of me. And so I'm able to navigate the world by using categories. But when we use those categories for groups of people, they often come with a lot of stereotypes and baggage. And a lot of times those stereotypes don't apply to specific individuals, to people who've had a bad interaction or heard something on the news that's bad about one or two members of a group, and we don't really know anyone else in the group. It's a pretty easy thing to do to think, okay, well, I should avoid them. But the problem with avoiding people, especially if you have a negative stereotype about them, is you'll never break the stereotype. You actually have to interact with people to learn that maybe the negative stereotype is wrong. And so that is also like one of the psychological challenges.
Okay, so when we're moving through the world in basic survival mode, our brains are generally trying to be efficient, using that fast, automatic category mode to decipher what's going on around us. But think about all the amazing stuff people in groups do together. If you wanted to cooperate with someone, you'd probably need way more information about them than just that they're on your team. You'd want to remember important facts about them. Maybe have a sense of what motivates them and what they're good at.
Parts of their brain involved in face perception are getting activated more. And what we find is that's related to better memory for in-group member faces. So they're actually paying more careful attention to in-group members. Other research has found that when you're part of a group, you start to look towards the eyes of in-group members more. And that's where a lot of information, especially emotional information and information about identity, is being conveyed. And so that seems to be part of what's driving their superior memory.
The dark side of this skill, of course, is that our brains only think it's important to gather all this extra detail about members of our own group. This is why dozens and dozens of studies have shown that, on average, people are better at recognizing members of their own race, and worse at telling apart people they perceive as others. The consequences of this cognitive weak spot are huge. It means, even at the most basic level of perception, we're less interested in accurately identifying and understanding people from outgroups. That not only perpetuates stereotypes and prejudice, it also contributes to erroneous convictions.
That's called the own race bias. And that's a really important thing because it affects things like eyewitness testimony in court cases, that if you can't remember somebody from another race, you'll point your finger at the wrong suspect if you were an eyewitness. And people have gone to jail, spent decades in jail for crimes they didn't commit because an eyewitness confused them with somebody from their race. And as in particular in America, this happens to black suspects regularly. And then they get exonerated by DNA. And so that's how we know that this was a mistake.
This evolutionary tendency has even more dangerous consequences. Because when our mind puts someone in the category of vague other rather than fleshed out individual, we also feel less empathy for them. And when we stop feeling empathy for people, we're also less motivated to end their pain. In some situations, we might even be more willing to harm them. But there's even a more subtle way that the greater empathy we feel for in-group members works.
In one of our studies with my student Lior Hackle, we brought in NYU students and they got to win some money. And when they win money, parts of their brain involved in the reward system kind of get activated. If they see an outgroup member win money, they don't really have that same response. But if they see an in-group member win money, you see this similar patterns of activation with reward in their brain. They feel good when they see an in-group member win money as long as they care about that group. And so that's a good thing because it can help us feel joy. It can incentivize us to work together. It can incentivize us to share things with in-group members.
But again, what's really useful for members of a group to be successful and supportive of one another has a potential dark side for anyone outside that group.
When it comes to outgroup members, especially ones we dislike or we're in competition with, That seems to be the key ingredient that makes us take pleasure at their pain or pain at their pleasure. And that can foster more conflict.
Taking pleasure in another's misfortune is a common enough experience that there's a word for it: schadenfreude. But getting to that point takes a little more than just seeing someone from another group.
Just being part of a group is kind of the first part of the recipe. And that will lead you to prefer in-group members, but it doesn't necessarily lead you to dislike or dehumanize out-group members. The ingredient we found that really makes you feel schadenfreude, pleasure at the pain of the out-group, is when there's competition. So the moment you're A, part of a team, and B, there's competition, that's when things start to heat up.
If you're a sports fan, you've probably felt this. I live in Boston, and so when the Yankees lose a game and their fans are upset, a lot of people here take some joy in that. A fact you can even see in their brains. Harvard psychologist Mina Cikara had fans of the two teams watch parts of games while in an fMRI and found that pleasure centers became more active when players on the opposing team struck out or were picked off bases. But when we move from sports competitions to competitions for real resources, things can go downhill pretty quickly.
That's actually the ingredients where you actually see like real racial or religious conflict. You see that with international conflict. You see that with political conflict and polarization. They're competing for land, for space, for power, for jobs.
So we all know examples of how this happens. We see examples of racial strife, of religious sectarianism dividing us in all different ways. But how deeply does this run? I mean, does there need to be long-standing conflict, or are we ready to kind of divide at the drop of a hat?
Yeah, I think both are true. So I think we have the capacity to divide up into groups, discriminate against others, engage in conflict, warfare, violence, but it doesn't need to be that way. And so one of the great, remarkable innovations throughout human history is building institutions that reduce conflict and foster ways of cooperating. And so we have all kinds of institutions that do this. And so if you look even over the last 100 or 200 years, the rates of intergroup violence have plummeted. And if you look even longer throughout human history, they've dropped even more. And so it looks like we're on a trajectory of less intergroup violence and conflict than we've ever had throughout human history. Of course, it doesn't always feel that way because we open the newspaper and you can easily find examples of group conflict going on in your backyard as well as certainly around the world. But on average, it seems like it's gotten better.
We can talk about how institutions do this in a moment, but at a personal level, how do we begin to expand our moral circle?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the powers of identity, and this can be leveraged in a very positive way, is that we are capable of forming moral circles that are more and more inclusive and expansive. I ran a study where we essentially flipped a coin and put groups of strangers into one team or another team in the lab. At that point, we called them the lions and the tigers. And within minutes, they started liking their in-group more. They wanted to be friends with them more. They trusted them more. And this happened even on measures that were like measuring their automatic reactions to in-group members and out-group members. We also found that it was able to bridge divides, that if you put people on a mixed race team, even by this coin flip, they started to like everybody regardless of race, as long as they're part of their team. We also put these same participants in a scanner and looked at their brain. And what we could see is that parts of their brain changed within a few minutes of being part of a team, so that when they were seeing members of their own group, parts of their brain involved in positive emotions were active, but parts of their brain involved in things like very basic early parts of the brain, like face perception, were active. And what that suggests is they were even looking at in-group members differently, paying attention to them differently. And so this is kind of a whole suite of things that get triggered in the mind, in the brain, the moment that you're part of a group. And we've, done this now with dozens and dozens of studies in many countries, and we find the same thing over and over again. If you're part of the same team of somebody, you have better memory for everybody who's part of your group, regardless of their race. We found that it helps you kind of identify perhaps the humanity and individuality in people. You can find a common ground or connection or shared identity, and that can kind of bring them psychologically into your sense of self.
This right here is a critical point. If we can't really stop our brain from categorizing people into us or them, we can change the criteria it uses. And that means we can expand our moral circles by changing who we think is like us. And if we use broader categories than who is on our team, who we care about can change too. But what about situations where that's not easy? Where we're already part of a group that's in conflict with another group?
One of our interventions that worked was creating a sense of cooperation between groups. You have these two groups competing and they're experiencing schadenfreude. The moment you have them cooperate in a competition against other teams, suddenly they don't have any schadenfreude anymore for the outgroup. They suddenly see them as part of their in-group. And so there's all these things you can do. And this happens in the real world. After 9/11 in the United States, George Bush, who was a Republican president, was pretty unpopular. His popularity is around 50%. Within a week after 9/11, Americans felt threatened and attacked by outsiders, and his approval went up to about 90%, I think, which is the highest recorded ever. And, it went down over time. But for a moment, everybody no longer felt like Democrats or Republicans. They felt like Americans. Cooperation is always happening. It's just the identity that matters to us right now is based partly on what our goals are and our motives are and what is salient to us in that moment.
At this point, you might be thinking, this is all well and good in theory, but how do we actually foster that cooperation beyond small, controlled lab groups?
I will say one of the key things here is unlocking healthy social norms. We have this notion that gets expressed over and over again on social media and by journalists that we are kind of tribalistic creatures, and that's almost like an inevitable outcome of our evolutionarily ancient brains. That doesn't have to be the case. So some groups have norms of conflict. They have chants and ways of acting and belief systems that foster violence against other groups. In America, you can think of like hate groups as kind of the canonical case of this. These are groups that their whole identity is to hate other groups. Or you can have groups that are more embracing of difference. The example that I love to use is like Doctors Without Borders. If you join Doctors Without Borders, part of the ethos and norms that you're accepting are helping people who are different from you and going around the world to connect with people who are radically different than you. And so the more you identify with that group of Doctors Without Borders, the more you commit to that mission. And so we can have missions that cause conflict or missions that foster support, helping, cooperation, and pro-sociality.
So one way to combat prejudice, then, is to have organizations advocate clear stances against discrimination. And if some people, especially leaders, actually walk the walk, those stances become more than empty words.
The first thing to know about norms is you only look to members of groups that you identify with to determine what the norms are. And so whether it's a workplace or a religious community or a national identity, you're looking to see, what do people like me do? What does it take to be a good group member? And you're trying to figure that out so you can fit in, so you can be a good group member, so you can contribute to group success. We're not looking to other groups to figure out, you're not looking to people in Sri Lanka to figure out how to be a good American. You look to other Americans to figure that out. If you're a good Christian, you look to other Christians, not to Muslims, to figure out how to be a good Christian. And so that's the first thing.
This effect is way more powerful than you might think. Here's just one example. Researchers in Italy asked high school students whether they'd be willing to organize an event for World Refugee Day or attend a pro-immigrant demonstration. But they also had the students say who in their class best represented the group. And it turns out that if they thought that person would support immigrants, they were likelier to support immigrants too. It's basically like peer pressure, but for good behavior.
The second thing I would say is that norms can be a part of the automatic or habits of mind. Once you get used to thinking and doing things a certain way, it becomes automated and reflexive. Usually that happens for people who've been in a group for a certain amount of time, and they just know automatically how to think about something. That's how norms work. They become automated, and you stop questioning them, and you just do them, and you act in ways that are consistent with the norm, and they guide all the ways that we think and do things.
In 1965, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King to ask for his help ending the Vietnam War. Over the next few years, the dialogue that developed between these two men brought the civil rights movement and the Buddhist tradition into conversation around activism and how to achieve change in the world. It's also how Larry Ward eventually heard about Thich Nhat Hanh and was introduced to Buddhism. Larry was raised Christian, and as an ordained Baptist minister, he still is. But those earlier experiences of racism he mentioned at the top of the episode left him with unresolved feelings of anger and trauma. So for Larry, seeing how Thich Nhat Hanh handled the hostility and violence he'd been faced with opened up a new world of possibility.
He had students and friends assassinated, and he was still incredibly peaceful. And so when I experienced that, I knew he was not an idea. He learned how to be with it in a way that was peaceful and compassionate.
No ideology is perfect, but Buddhism is one of the best examples of a tradition that is built on norms of non-discrimination and loving kindness. The community that Thich Nhat Hanh founded in the 60s, the Order of Interbeing, was itself born of the violence and divisions sown during the Vietnam War. And so from the beginning, it had an even stronger focus on ending violence, promoting peaceful communication, and building understanding across divides. Of the community's 14 guiding principles, which are called mindfulness trainings, the first is about cultivating an open mind. The second is about not getting too attached to your point of view, and therefore becoming narrow-minded. The mindfulness trainings aren't rules like the Bible's 10 Commandments. They're more like good practices, always nudging you in the direction of reconnecting with yourself and with others. They teach practitioners how to deal with their anger, handle conflict, and live in greater harmony with the world. And Thich Nhat Hanh himself often said that the goal of the trainings wasn't to make people become Buddhists, but to help them live more peaceful and compassionate lives, no matter their theological beliefs. The starting point for all of these trainings and changes, though, is a straightforward one: mindfulness. It's by cultivating an acute awareness of the present moment, your thoughts, your feelings, your propensities to judge others and yourself, that the automatic workings of the mind can be changed, not only when you sit down to meditate, but throughout your day. For Larry, learning about mindfulness helped him carve out a path toward healing from the trauma he had lived with throughout his life, and eventually to become a Buddhist teacher and nonviolent activist himself.
What I found helpful is the practice of mindfulness as a focus allows me to be there every day, healing myself every day through my breathing and my conscious awareness of the miracle of being alive, no matter my circumstance. If you go deep enough into the stillness that tradition offers you, you begin to heal your nervous system. Walking meditation. I used to work at a hospital, and I'd go to the parking lot and I'd walk slowly to my office. It doesn't have to be in a temple that you practice. It has to be in your daily life to receive the full benefit of what the practice can offer you. I even open doors differently, more slowly, taking my time. I go through the phone a little slower and slow myself down before I try to listen to what's being communicated to me. All of these are very mundane activities we do every day. But when we bring the quality of mindfulness, deep attention, and stillness to our movements and our thinking and our language and our speech, we can orient ourselves more toward healing rather than orient ourselves toward destruction.
Of course, it's hard to remember to be mindful all the time. But Buddhism has many brilliant tools to help with that. Meditation is one, and probably the most familiar. But another is a long-standing Zen tradition known as a gatha. Gathas are short, simple verses that practitioners can recite aloud or in their mind as they go about their day. So, when it comes to a topic, a gatha can be about anything. That's the point. The whole goal is to call our attention to the present and focus our minds on Buddhist teachings while we engage in activities as mundane as, say, using the phone.
Words can travel thousands of miles. May my words create mutual understanding and love. May they be as beautiful as gems, as lovely as flowers.
What happens when you memorize these verses and say them regularly is that they start coming to you on their own. It's a really clever way to help bring your attention back to being mindful. And as Jay Van Bavel would say, to make the norm automatic. And once we're in the habit of paying attention to our mind and body throughout our daily lives, we're much likelier to be able to remember to do that when strong emotions come our way.
It's a natural experience to be angry, otherwise you're not really paying attention to what's happening. The benefit for me of meditation has been to be able to watch that happen. So I watch it happen before it happens, and I get to decide, is that what I want to have happen? What would be the benefit of that happening? What would be the cost of that happening? And so I learned how to be cognitively more sophisticated. I understand my nervous system. I can feel anger when it comes. I can feel it start in my feet. That much sensitivity can be developed through meditation and mindfulness of the body. And so I know how now to stop it before it gets to my mouth or my hands. And so learning how to know what to hold on to and what to let go of is a very important practice. And so why meditation is important is I am training myself to be aware of what I might be holding on to, that I need to let go of, or what I need to hold that I'm not holding that's there for me, that can help me heal and transform my pain.
Thich Nhat Hanh believed that in order to cultivate peace, we can't just ignore or suppress our anger. He thought this was such an important step that the 6th of his 14 mindfulness trainings is devoted entirely to taking care of anger, figuring out how to create a space within ourselves to observe our anger and to try to understand it before we take the next step of deciding how to react to it. He gave a really good example for this. If your house is on fire, is chasing down the arsonist the first thing you need to do? Or is it dealing with the burning fire in your house?
Gatha for smiling at anger. Breathing in, I feel my anger. Breathing out, I smile. I stay with my breathing so I won't lose myself.
One of the basic fundamental parts of human psychology is that we tend to divide ourselves into us versus them along lots of dimensions, whether it's race, whether it's religion, whether it's sexual orientation. And another aspect of basic human psychology is that we tend to care more for the people who are on our side, on our team. We feel their pain more. We feel more compassion for them. So what is it about meditation that allows us to break down those categorizations, to kind of see everybody as equally worthy of concern?
Well, for me, meditation provides the opportunity to see through your mental constructs, to learn the nature of your own mind, how it thinks, how it's been conditioned, what it has a tendency to run toward, what it has a tendency to run away from. And for me, the more I learned about Larry, the more I learned about everyone else. It really breaks down the dualism that you refer to, because we all suffer. No one escapes. And we're all are yearning for, lack of a better word, the experience of paradise, which none of us are finding together. And we're using our energy to fight about what the meaning of paradise is instead of living in it. I can recognize, oh, Larry, there you go. There your mind goes. And your feelings are going this way. Your feelings are going, and whichever way mind or feelings go is how they go. It's natural. I don't have to judge myself as a poor human being because I'm having a human experience. I am learning to master my response to my human experience. And that's what meditation can provide for a practitioner.
So part of it is retraining your mind a bit to see through those categories that we create and that can divide us. And some of it, exactly as you said, I think is a practice. We're not going to be perfect at that Part of that is human. But when those emotions come because we're dividing, because we're separating, because we're seeing people as in competition with us, we don't have to follow it down the rabbit hole. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And part of the practice of meditation for me is to recognize the tendency before it becomes a behavior, to recognize your draw to the rabbit hole and to understand what's calling you there. So it's not just there's a rabbit hole. It is, why am I yearning to go that direction? Where did that conditioning come from? And do I have to hold on to that?
Gatha for letting go. Hearing the bell, I am able to let go of all afflictions. My heart is calm, my sorrows ended. I am no longer bound to anything. I learn to listen to my suffering and the suffering of the other person. When understanding is born in me, compassion is also born.
One of the issues I think that often gets in the way is, even if you don't hold animosity to people of a certain ethnicity, race, religion, etc., we often feel like we're in competition.
Yes.
That is, life is a zero sum. If, I've got to, I don't begrudge you things, but I need what's good for my people to protect me. How do you overcome that when it feels like that's the way the world works?
I think the first thing for me to remember is we've been conditioned to be that way. This is not evident in all of human history, to have this level of intense perception that in order for me to eat, I have to kill you. We've been conditioned to behave like that. We've been rewarded to behave like that.
And we also hear like, this group is coming to take our jobs, or this group is coming to bring
Instead
crime,
of realizing the jobs you're even thinking about won't be here 20 years from now, whoever you are. This is what equanimity can give you, is a larger picture of what's actually happening.
How does it do that? By taking away the emotional component?
No,
or
it does. For me, it does that by quite the opposite, bringing in the emotional component. So I can recognize this makes me scared about my future. And then I look across the room and I say, other people are scared about their future, but they don't have the practice memory in their body to recognize it.
I'm glad Larry corrected me here, as I fell into the trap that many people do, thinking that Buddhism is about not feeling things. It's not meant to make us heartless androids, or for you Star Trek fans, Vulcans like Mr. Spock. Emotions are part and parcel of being human. What mindfulness does do is it helps us to be aware of our feelings, rather than controlled by them. We can recognize anger and fear and let them pass. New research is also showing that meditation, by breaking down our tendency to categorize people, can retrain our minds to see the common spark of humanity in all of us. To realize that supposed enemies also feel fear, pain, and sorrow, and in so doing, to short-circuit our tendency to care less for them.
Gatha for greeting someone. A lotus for you, a Buddha to be.
I was in Florida visiting my mother-in-law a few years ago, who was 93 at the time, and wanted a newspaper. So I went to a convenience store to get her Sunday paper, and I picked up the paper and walked up to the counter, and the person behind the counter laid a gun on the table. And I said, "Are you okay?" I'm just here for the paper. And the person was shocked that I would ask about them. Because what that can do is call the person's mind back to their behavior and call their attention back to their emotional state. So learning to listen when you can, when I can, is a very important practice for me. And none of this is funny, but it is. Because for me, it reveals the ridiculousness of how we can think, how we can be silly in non-helpful ways with one another. And, most of us don't even know one another. We barely know ourselves. And so what we know is stories we've been told.
When you don't act with fear or aggression back, I'm thinking of that man who put the gun on the table. How does that change what the other person does?
Their body, in reading the body, their breathing calms down. The energy of aggression in their nervous system starts to calm down because they are shocked at a calm response, literally shocked into a kind of temporary stillness. Like, what am I dealing with here?
Our work doesn't end when we understand ourselves. Once we've started to address our own biases, our own anger by doing all the internal work of taking apart mental constructs and cultivating equanimity, we've got to get out there into the world and do something to make it better. The 8th and 9th mindfulness trainings of the Order of Interbeing are all about fostering healthy communication in order to break down barriers and build community. And Thich Nhat Hanh talked about a couple tools in particular to help us achieve exactly this. The first is called deep listening. Thich Nhat Hanh encouraged people to see listening as a meditation practice rather than as gathering ammunition to make their next point. He thought we should practice offering a non-judgmental ear as a gift to the other, providing a space for them to release their own suffering, no matter how wrong we think they might be. If we could learn to just listen, it would constitute an important first part of the healing process. And as an added bonus, it would create the opportunity for us to discover what our own misconceptions might be. The second is loving speech. We've already talked about how Thich Nhat Hanh didn't believe in suppressing our feelings. He also thought that once we've spent the time mindfully processing our anger, sadness, and fear, it isn't enough to just leave it at that. We then have a responsibility to do maybe the hardest thing of all, to tell the others about these thoughts and emotions. The key here is to learn how to do this without including judgment or blame in our speech, to speak of our own suffering and our own failings, to help the other understand how they might help us. None of this is easy to do. It doesn't come naturally, at least not as naturally as dividing the world into us versus them. But there's a reason practices like these are at the core of most nonviolent communication and peace-building methods. They are proven to open a path to healing. And with the support of a healthy mindfulness practice and/or a community that values and encourages these norms, they're one of our best shots at working toward a more loving and inclusive world, one where us includes everyone. How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman, our producer is Sophie Eisenberg, and executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks.org. And for news and peeks at what's coming, feel free to follow us on Instagram at HowGodWorksPod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.